One very much. Can I have one just like
Good morning. I call to order the September 2023 meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. Thank you to those who are joining us via the live stream video and those who are attending here in the boardroom. Our first item of business is our 2023-2024 committee work plan. Vice Chair Mayron and I worked with Executive Director and Corporate Secretary Steves and his team to design the work plan. So Executive Director Steves, could you walk us through the work plan, please?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'd be happy to do that. I won't go through the plan necessarily month by month, but instead I'll talk about the four major things that this plan addresses, or the four major topics that you'll be focused on this year. The first is committee role and structure. We'll be having a series of conversations around both the structure of the committee as well as the delegated authority of your committees. And so you'll see that throughout the work plan. The second major topic is reserved and delegated authority that the board has. So as you may recall, all authority rests with the board, and it delegates significant portions of that authority to the administration for implementation. And so within that are reserved authorities like approval thresholds. And so one of the things that this committee will be focused on this year is doing a comprehensive review of that policy, it's up for review this year, and with a particular emphasis on what are the right approval thresholds for the board. You want to hit the right balance so that you're not having so many things come back to the board that it's gumming up your agendas. On the other hand, you don't want to be so loose on the delegations that the board misses the key things that you want to be engaged with. Third item is the process around presidential conflicts of interest. Right now, policy is rather light on that, and it routes the president through like any employee in a conflict of interest kind of situation. And so there was some desire for this to be built into the work plan so that the committee can take up some more robust policy language on that.
And the timing on that is intentional.
Yes, the timing is intended to ensure that policy is in place before you have a new president start, so that if there are any conflict issues that need to be dealt with, there'll be a new process in place to handle those. And then finally, you will take up and revisit the virtual forum that you launched last year that this committee charged the office to launch and went live in August. This month is your first month to see those virtual forum comments in your docket, and that the public can see those as well. And so we're running that pilot program this year, and this committee will then come back around and evaluate how it went and if there are changes that are desired and if you want the pilot to continue. And you'll make recommendations to the board on that. So those are the four major areas that are reflected in the work plan, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions on this committee's work plan for the year? It's full. Yeah, Regent Turner.
Just about the website, is it going to be collecting data throughout this pilot, like how many people use it and all that? I mean, we're going to be able to have numbers.
The virtual forum, Regent Turner? Yes, Executive
Okay.
Director Steves.
Madam Chair and Regent Turner, yes, we are collecting data, and we've also built in one of those ubiquitous customer surveys at the end of it. So when someone submits a comment, they get asked about how the experience was as well.
Anything else? Great. Well, thank you so much, Executive Director Steves. Our next item is review of proposed amendments to two board policies that delegate authority to our two omnibus committees, or committees of the whole. The amendments are a result of previous conversations the board had and a desire to streamline committee reports. The two policies that are included in your docket materials really do work together and interact with each other. And so I would like to ask our Associate Secretary Jason Langworthy to walk us through that interrelationship, just so we're all clear. So Associate Secretary Langworthy, please proceed.
Chair Verhalen, members of the committee, good morning.
Morning.
So let me start off with sort of a reminder of what currently happens, and you'll see this later this afternoon. So right now, all of the committees of the board, with the exception of the Litigation Review Committee and the Audit and Compliance Committee, when they want to add additional audits for the Office of Internal Audit to do, everything else that committees do require the committees to make a recommendation to the full board. So even when, like yesterday, in mission fulfillment, you approved a consent report and all 12 of you were there, or for finance and operations when you approved the consent report or the real estate transaction, those items still have to return to the board, and you'll see them return to the board later this morning in a committee report, and then you'll vote on them again. So it's sort of a two-step process because the authority is reserved to the board. The committees are simply making a recommendation. When you discussed this topic previously, there was an interest to streamline that, especially for mission fulfillment and finance and operations, where the board is sitting as a committee to avoid having to take a second vote on Friday during those committee reports. So to do that, we need to amend two policies. And these two policies are really at the heart of your sort of governance operations as the Board of Regents. So those policies are reservation and delegation of authority and board operations and agenda guidelines. And I'll talk through how we're doing this. And we're using the current precedent from the Litigation Review Committee to help guide our work. So reservation and delegation of authority reserves authorities to the board. It sort of defines the work that you do as a board throughout the year. So what areas does the board need to weigh in on? What areas then are delegated to primarily the president? Now, there are other board policies that will sort of provide more details, excuse me, but reservation and delegation of authority sort of defines it broadly, what all of those items are. I'm just going to take a sip of water.
Hold, please.
Within reservation delegation authority, then, there are sections, excuse me, there are sections that then are delegated to various committees to cover. And so those are outlined on the docket item summary on page 6. So right now, board operations and agenda guidelines, or we affectionately call it BOAG, takes those sections and basically assigns it to committees. So it says, hey, mission fulfillment, you're going to have jurisdiction or sort of look at these areas that the board has reserved authority to. Finance and operations, you're going to do that in these areas. And those are outlined there in the docket item summary on page 6. So to make the change, we need to change both policies. So in reservation and delegation of authority, you'll see throughout the policy, and there's a good example of this starting on page 20 of the docket materials, where the board reserves to itself, and then we're going to add or to one of its committees. And so any area that already flows through either mission fulfillment or finance and operations, we're adding that language in to allow the board to act through one of its committees instead of sitting as the full board. Then in board operations and agenda guidelines, you're telling the committees that then they can do that. So then you're saying, hey, finance and operations, you have the authority to act on our behalf. And so you'll see that on page 12 of the docket. So specifically, this committee, instead of recommends, approves on behalf of the board. So you're reserving the authority in reservation and delegation of authority. You're allowing committees to act on your behalf. And then in board operations and agenda guidelines, you're telling the committees you can act on our behalf. Now, what I will say is that this does not change the chair's ability to control the agenda or the chair's ability to, if they felt necessary, to route things to the full board. This changes the default setting, if you will, but it still allows the chair, if they want to put an item on the full board agenda from one of the committees. A good example of that right now is public safety. Technically, under board operations and agenda guidelines, those conversations should be happening at the Finance and Operations Committee, but Chair Mayron has pulled those up to the full board to sort of show the board's interest and commitment in that area. So that's a recent example. So that could still happen. The other thing that I would say is if a committee, if you are feeling unsure, because sometimes there are questions that come up, there needs to be some more information, someone could change the motion instead of approve to recommend approval or to forward to the board without a recommendation. That would allow then between Thursday and Friday, say the administration to gather more information and then for the board to feel comfortable if they wanted to act or not. But by default, when you're sitting as either finance and operations or mission fulfillment, if these amendments were adopted, then it would be a one vote option to approve the items that come before those committees for action. And with that, Chair Verheugen, I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you, and I think it's really important to remember, rooted in all of this, is the changes we're making on approving on behalf of the board only relate to our omnibus committees of the whole, which are finance and operations and mission fulfillment. So governance and policy cannot approve on behalf of the board in these revisions that we're asking. So where it's only a portion of the board, we're not making any changes to those committees and their authority and that delegated by the board under our existing policy. It is only to mission fulfillment and finance and operations, thank you, finance and operations that the revisions are to allow those committees to approve on behalf of the board. Regent Turner.
You answered most of the question, and I.
Great. Okay, oh, yes, if everyone, when you're, yeah, the two rooms are mic'd differently, so just please make sure if you're speaking, the microphones are pointed toward you. Thank you.
Chair Van Halen, so you answered most of my question. Would the mission fulfillment or the finance committee ever be switched? I go back to my own example where the political committee for the last 8 years at M&A has always been the full board because I chose to do it that way, have everybody in on it. But it didn't necessarily have to be. A new person coming in could say, no, we just want half the group. Would these two committees always be the full board? Or is it something that could change from?
I will preface that before I hand it off to you, Assistant Secretary Steve. I demoted you and promoted him. Oh, Assistant Secretary Langworthy. The interesting function of this board is that we operate under our policies, and we can change our policies by a motion of this board at any moment in time. But I will let you take it from there.
Chair Verheugen, Regent Turner, that is the discussion that we're going to start in the next agenda item. And so what does the structure of the board's committees look like? Oh. And if you want to stay with a omnibus committee of the finance and operations, mission fulfillment, or if you want to create other omnibus committees, right? Up until this meeting, this committee recently was an omnibus committee. So what I would say is, as those committee conversations move forward, if the board were to decide that all committees were committees of the 6, then I think we would, as a part of that action to remake the committee descriptions, we would probably pull this language back out then.
I mean, don't get me wrong, Chair Van Halen, I'm all for I'm all for the concept of only doing it when you've got the full board. Because like I said, in my board, it gets redundant. We're all here for political, and now we got to vote on it again. So that, I'm all for that. I'm not necessarily for dividing it up and only 6 people deciding on everything at any given time. So that's my own personal.
Are there any other questions, any other discussion right now?
Oh,
Sure. Regent Hipsch.
When I first got on this board, I thought it was really silly that.
Can you move your microphone, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I got to remind me. When I first got on this board, I thought it was really silly that we were voting on the same people were voting on the same thing the next day that we voted on the previous day. And I was wondering why that was, and now I kind of know why it was. It was because of policy, but I think that since we have the ability to change the policy, we should on those 2 committees. And I think this is just a great idea, and and if it frees up time on this day to have one more speaker, it's worth it, and that's the benefit. That redundancy takes time, and we only have so much of it. So I'm for the change, ASAP.
Well, Sorry, Regent Johnson, my
I just want to
apologies.
say, no, I agree with Regent Hipsch. I think streamlining, we've done this now for a few years, doing things twice, duplicative things that are unnecessary because we've already vetted for the entire board and all of us have had a chance to vote will save us unnecessary time. And as Regent Hipsch said, maybe another speaker or another topic we can take on. So I think efficiency in this way with transparency is very reasonable.
Anything else? I apologize that I talked over you. Sorry. Regent Wheeler.
Thank you very much, Chair Verhalen. I totally agree too. Why be redundant and why not hear more from those things that are most critical? The only question I have is because live streaming capabilities sometimes are lacking in the committee meetings, they're recorded but then available. Are we concerned about that at all in the transparency of some of the decisions we make in those forums?
Go ahead.
Chair Verhalen, Regent Wheeler, the committees of the whole meet in here.
So they're
and
all
this room will
live-streamed.
always be live streamed. It's just the committees that meet in the West Committee room at this point don't have that capability.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Regent Mayron.
Yep. Chair Mayron, Regent Mayron. Vice Chair Mayron.
Whatever, vice chair to the committee. I have a question, a procedural question. It appears to me that everybody is in support of the policy change that is reflected in the docket. And so the question is, and right now it's before us for review and presumably action by our committee in October. And then assuming we adopt it in October, then it would go to the board that same morning because we meet the same morning as the board meeting for action, hopefully in October by the board. But in other words, it wouldn't be effective until December, which would be a shame. I think in our collective view, I think everybody's on board with this idea of doing this and doing it sooner rather than later for all the reasons that we've talked about. So my question is this. I understand right now it's for review. If there doesn't seem to be any objection to the policy, and in fact, everybody has stated on board, I understand we could make a motion to, one of us, myself included, could make a motion to, in fact, approve the policy now out of governance, and assuming it passes, then would it go to the full board in the next couple hours for their action as well, so that we can get this in place? Or does it have to wait and go on the October agenda for the board, and then we're right back to where I think all of us would like to avoid, which is not enacting this or implementing it until December?
So under our board policies, typically changes to policy are reviewed in one meeting and then review and action in the next meeting. But because this is an internal board policy, any regent can make a request, as long as there's no objection, to do the approval at this point in time. So then the item would change from just review to review and action. And so my question would be, is there someone interested in making that request, that we make today an action item?
I am.
Regent Hipsch?
A second.
Okay. Are there any objections to that? Because the way the policy works is if there's an objection to making that, then we wouldn't proceed.
None.
All right, so there being no objections, we will now consider this item for review and action. So given that, is there a motion to recommend adoption of the proposed amendments?
I would move it.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? All right, so just so we're all clear, and so everyone understands procedure, the motion before us is to recommend approval of these changes to the policy that will then go to the board for review and approval in about an hour and a half, just so everyone is clear. So there being any further discussion? All right, there being no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed? The motion is approved.
So just to answer then my question, and I think you said it at the very end. So this approved motion out of this committee will now go to the full board for consideration during the board meeting. It'll be, I assume, part of your report to the board, and will then go for a motion would be made at that time to approve the change in policy that governance is recommending. Is that procedurally how this is going to work then? I just want to make sure we understand.
That's correct, yes. So OBR will be adjusting my committee report to reflect that this committee is making that recommendation to the full board for approval.
Okay. I'm just wondering procedurally if it would make sense. Well, in order to educate the other 6 board members who aren't here in this committee, to get a communication out to them, now, attaching the approved policy from governance so that they have an opportunity, if they want to, or to tell them where to find it in their board materials. I guess they can do that by going directly to governance, so they see what's going to be coming for them for by motion for approval.
Yeah, I'll hand that over to Executive Director Steves. I will say, just so everyone's aware, this is not the first time we've done this. We did this spring as well on another one, and so we've walked through this recently. But Executive Director Steves, briefly.
Chair Verhalen, we also discussed this at the retreat and there was no opposition. So that's where this originated from, so.
Good clarification.
Right, and it's simply that we're asking people to change, to approve language that some of 6 members may not have read because they're not on the governance committee. So I don't have any, I'm confident everyone wants to make this change. It's making sure they're aware of the language change.
Executive Director Steves, I would certainly hope everyone read it because it was still on the board's docket.
Madam Chair and Regent Mayron, we are confident that regents read all of the dockets for all of the committees, and so we believe that they'll have seen the language. This is exactly the trade-off that gets made between omnibus committees and 6-person committees. And so the tradition always has been, when there have been 6-person committees, that if a recommendation comes forward, the chair of the committee then speaks at the board, and if there are questions at the board meeting about the policy or the change or whatever the recommendation is, the chair is there to represent the committee and speak and answer those questions, and obviously call on staff as needed. But it would be atypical to try to communicate with regents now, in the 15-minute break to try and get them up to speed with what the committee has done. We would let the committee report really stand as the communication around what the committee's action is.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure I understood how this was going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Any additional follow-up? All right. So our next item is the first discussion in our series on the board's overall committee structure. This conversation is going to really provide us with the context and some potential principles to consider as we continue in these conversations throughout this rest of this year and through our work plan. So to take us through this item are Executive Director Steves and Associate Secretary Langworthy. So Executive Director Steves, would you start us off, please?
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Verhalen and members of the committee. We can go ahead and advance to this first slide. As we look at the board's committee structure, I know it's a topic that everyone is very excited to dive into. But
The six of us.
exactly. Think of it this way. Many of your policies address the what, the what kinds of topics you as a board will engage in. Which items are coming to you for approval, and things of that nature. This conversation is focused on how. The portfolio of items that come to you, and whether there should be adjustments or changes, is something else we're going to be talking about in this committee. But this conversation is, how do you actually want to digest and view and work through the items of business before you? And so that's the guided discussion that we'll have here, basically, across a number of meetings. And the reason that it's laid out this way is we actually found great success the last time the Governance and Policy Committee did this in kind of unpacking it a little at a time, working through what are the trade-offs, what are the principles that are going to guide what it is that you want in a structure, so that you get the outcome you want at the end of this. We're able to design a structure that is really almost infinite in terms of possibility. It's just a matter of it meeting your needs, because ultimately the how has to meet the needs of the 12 that sit around the table. And that's the goal. It should serve you. And if it doesn't serve you, then we should modify it. But we need to make sure we're modifying it and then not creating new issues that we haven't anticipated. So that's what we're going to do. We'll break this into some parts. Today we're talking about some context so that you understand where this board has been and where it is right now. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the principles that guided past discussions. Then the next time we revisit this topic, we'll talk about committee portfolios so that you understand the breadth of coverage that each committee has on various topics. We'll talk about the role of standing committees versus special committees, which right now is something that this board has. It has 2 special committees. It has also a number of standing committees. That is all rooted in board policy, and so we should look at that. You should understand what drives the creation of a standing committee versus a special committee. And then from all of those conversations, and so we encourage, as in today's conversation and others, be giving us feedback, help us understand what would be helpful, what isn't helpful, what do you prefer, what do you not prefer, because we're going to be trying to capture all of that and bringing it into a set of policy recommendations that would come back to this committee for review and then action. And so that's our goal across time with this conversation. All right, so we can move to our next slide here. The Board of Regents, if you go all the way back to 1851, has had many, many different committee structures. And so there have been numerous models that have been used across time. And I think what that speaks to is the fact that it's an ever-evolving topic. It's one that committees come and committees go. Committees are merged and separated. And all of that happens across time because the needs and issues change, because the preferences of the people that are on this board change, and there's also technology changes. And so all of those have driven changes in the board's committee structure across time. Prior to 2017, and so we're just going to talk about recent history, prior to 2017, this is the committee structure that existed. It just demonstrates that audit and compliance will never give up the Thursday 8 a.m. time slot. But audit and compliance was meeting on Thursdays, starting the day, and then governance and policy and litigation review were each 6-person committees, and they were sharing a time slot, which meant that every other meeting they were alternating. And so they each met about 4 times a year. That's how that worked. So in other words, the litigation review committee and the governance and policy committee were the same 6 regents. So they would alternate in terms of which committee they were meeting as each meeting. So they had different chairs, but that was how that functioned. Then the board had an academic and student affairs committee, which is sort of self-explanatory, largely focused on mission-type issues. It had a finance committee. There was always a lunch break, and the board had a long-standing tradition of hosting guests over lunch, usually downstairs, usually larger lunch events. Then the board had, this ebbed and flowed across time, but in this pre-17 structure, they had a tradition of the board convening as a full board of regents for a work session. There were no action items on a work session. There were nothing up for review, nothing up for action. This was intended to be a deep conversation about a topic of interest to the board or that the president is bringing to the board. And so this would be like a deep dive on one topic, like enrollment management or some issue of the day that the board would kind of dive into. But again, not teed up for action. If there were action, it would go back, it would be through the committees or through the full board. Then the board had the Faculty and Staff Affairs Committee, which was largely focused on, it married up HR issues and kind of appointments of senior leaders, as well as student affairs issues, which is kind of an odd combination, but that's how that committee was structured. And then the Facilities Planning and Operations Committee, and that was focused primarily on the physical infrastructure of the university. And then Friday, the board would meet. There weren't, the board would often actually have a breakfast together that was a social opportunity. And then the board would have a full board meeting for about 3 hours.
Brian, can I just interrupt 1 second just for clarification before you move on? Going back to that, Madam Chair, may I interrupt Brian?
Yes, Regent Mayron, no problem.
Thank you. Just so I understand, in the pre-2017 structure, when academic and student affairs are meeting and when finance was meeting, and then in the afternoon, the 3 to 5 slot, were those committees of the entire board, or were those 6-person committees as well?
Executive
Madam Chair, Regent Mayron, these were all 6-person committees. There were no 12-person committees, only the board.
Thank you.
So in this structure, the gold, and you'll see this throughout, the gold represents times when all 12 regents were together. So they were together for, lunch and kind of social opportunities, but then they met together for a work session, and they met together as a full board. One of the observations that the board had at the time is that collectively, they weren't together very often. And so when you add up the hours, actually, they were together about 35 hours across the course of a year as a 12. And so one of the principles, and so when we turn to kind of the principles and objectives that the board had at the time, so the Governance and Policy Committee engaged in a series of conversations around what is it that's working well and what's not working well with our current structure. And out of those conversations came some guiding principles or objectives that the committee outlined, that the committee used, that said these should guide whatever we're going to do with committee structure going forward. And so they said, 1, we want to enhance opportunities for the board to focus collectively on consequential issues. So we want, in some ways, we want maybe more time together. We want more time together that we can focus more deeply on issues that are important that we need to address. They wanted to reduce information asymmetry. They felt like often they ran into issues where some regents expressed frustration that they were excluded from some conversations because they weren't on a particular committee that they wanted to be on. But when you have 6 and 6, you have to make, there have to be 6 on each committee, and so that means that some people's preferences couldn't be honored. And so there was this information asymmetry issue that people were grappling with. They wanted to promote greater board cohesion, and they also wanted to increase transparency and public access to the board's work. And this was opportunistic in the sense that the committees, all committee meetings, happened in the East and West Committee Room, which had no technology available for even video recording. The West Committee Room has since been upgraded to allow some video recording, but they didn't have video recording equipment. They didn't have, any of the modern kinds of technology available. And so all committee meetings were happening in those rooms, and then the full board met here. And the full board was then being live streamed and available and archived and all of that. With the change that the committees, with the change to that the governance and policy adopted, it allowed for committee work to be live streamed as well. And so since 2017, that change went into effect. So those are some of the principles that guided it. And so I'll turn it over to Mr. Langworthy to walk through what that structure looked like, what the outcome of that work was.
Chair Verhalen, members of the committee, so you can see on the screen before you then is the result that the board adopted to achieve the objectives from 2017. So the goal again is when the board, when all 12 regents would meet together, and you can see there's quite a bit more gold. And so as Mr. Steves mentioned, this basically doubles then the amount of time that the board met together and was together either in committee meetings, at lunch, or as the full board. So we again start off the morning with audit and compliance and litigation review. Those remained 6-person committees. At the time it was felt, given the specialization of both, that it was helpful to keep those as 6 regent committees. And because litigation review is typically always closed, they would meet in the West Committee Room. Audit and compliance would meet in here to allow it to be live streamed and archived on our YouTube channel. Then mission fulfillment took academic and student affairs and the faculty components from faculty and staff affairs and combined those into one committee, focusing on the mission, focusing on the student experience, and focusing on the experience of faculty or faculty-like members of the university community. Then typically there would be a lunch break. This was used for some outside groups, maybe not quite as expansive as sort of the pre-2017. But I'll also note that this structure, right, was directly impacted by the pandemic. Yeah. So a lot of, the time that the board has spent in this structure was also modified into virtual meetings, or we weren't able to have sort of the outreach or engagement activities because of the pandemic. So while that lunch was a little bit scaled back, it was even more scaled back because of the pandemic era. In terms of then the afternoon, finance and operations. So finance and operations took everything from finance, so budget, in terms of the operating budget, in terms of the endowment, in terms of purchasing policies, all of those pieces, and combined it with the facilities and planning and operations committee. The other thing that was put in there at the time was also HR issues. So sort of broader HR issues were also combined into finance and operations. This was, again, to sort of create this omnibus committee. It also aligned at the time with the administrative structure. At that point within the university's history, HR, finance, facilities, university services all reported to the senior vice president for finance and operations. Since then, HR has been broken off and now reports directly to the president, but remains within the finance and operations committee portfolio. And so another committee of the whole, and I'll note, typically in the afternoon, because that committee coordinator tends to run that committee over. So wanted to make sure that there's time in the afternoon. Yep. Then on Friday, we placed the governance and policy committee in the morning. And it was felt after sort of the experiment in the pre-2017 that this was an important committee and an important committee for all 12 regents to be a part of. So we placed that sort of as an experiment on Friday. It was typically met for an hour. And then we would go right into the full board meeting on Friday morning. And so that's the structure up until this summer. And then the current interim structure then, as as you sort of kind of came to, and Chair Mayron has implemented over the course of this year as we consider what's next for the board's committee structure. And this is what we're operating under currently. So litigation review, we've decoupled right now from the board meetings. Since those meetings are closed, we've sort of decoupled them from the board meetings, and we're working on establishing a regular sort of sequence for them. But that gave us the opportunity then to have two special committees without sort of having to also figure out where litigation review sort of fits in these 2 days. So you'll see here, again, Gold is full, all 12 regents meeting together. So Thursday morning, audit and compliance, remaining a committee of 6, and then adding this special committee on academic health. Mission fulfillment then, our lunch break, which we're hoping to bring back some of those engagement opportunities within that time period, and then finance and operations. And finance and operations will likely shift in the afternoon based on how much time we need for lunch, or when maybe if there's an activity in the evening or afternoon.
Or if that chair is running really behind.
Or if the chair is running really behind, correct, yes.
Go all night.
And then just on Friday, so then to create another spot for that other special committee. This committee then has become a committee of 6. And then down the hall meeting right now is the special committee on university relations, also a committee of 6. And then finally, the full board will meet again together here later this morning. And so we do have some discussion questions that can help us sort of perhaps guide the conversation if you'd like to react to these. But if you have questions about the history, or certainly we would be interested in your input as we think about what's working well, what are some challenges, and probably thinking more about that 2017 to 2023, although you could certainly comment on the interim structure as well. And then, I think as we start to move through this conversation through the year, we're interested in knowing, are there agenda topics or areas of interest that you think are missing from our current committee portfolios? Or are some portfolios too thin, some have too much? And then certainly, are there principles like we used for the last review that would be helpful to help guide the conversation? And so with that, Chair Verheugen, Mr. Steeves and I are ready for questions, and certainly would be interested in hearing the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Langworthy. To start us off, and I see Regent Mayron's hand, but as an initial matter, I think it's valuable for us to explore on a regular basis what our structures look like, and what our committee portfolios include, and whether we need to reshuffle or reorganize or reprioritize, because otherwise inertia is an incredible force, and it's easy to just keep doing things the way we've been doing them, or the way that they've been done in the past. And so being able to take this time and really walk through each of these steps of the process, I certainly appreciate. Regent Mayron.
Thank you. I just have another question by way of background, and by my question, I don't mean to suggest we should be going back to this, but with the pre-2017 structure, given the only time the board met under that structure as together was either for the board work session or the Board of Regents. When items came up for review and action in the other committees, which were all committees of 6, then how did, I assume they would have reviewed whatever change or whatever issue du jour was on the table. If it required action, take action as a committee of 6, and then at some point, it would go to the board for its consideration and ultimately adoption or rejection. Is that how it worked? And if so, how did those committees then get all of that information to the board so that they could be able to be in a position to understand the particular issues that were up for approval and action, and then ultimately act on it?
Assistant Secretary Langworthy.
Chair Verheugen, Regent Mayron, so much in the same way that we just talked about sort of the recommendation from this committee is how all committee business would flow through the board. So it would come via the committee reports. Some significant items like the annual operating budget would be scheduled, or the annual capital improvement budget would be scheduled as standalone items on the board agenda, but Regents wouldn't have all of the sort of lead up conversations, right? If you weren't in the finance committee, you wouldn't have sort of the variables and levers conversations, or hear Vice President Tonneson talk about how the budget was shaped. We even also then had issues where we had the capital improvement budget, where facilities would be looking at the projects, but without any of the financial sort of insight, because that membership was different than what was on the finance committee. And then the finance committee would be looking at that from sort of debt capacity. But, there would be some overlap there, but it would be sort of, we would be considering the budget on sort of two parallel paths, and that information wouldn't come back together until we reached the full board. And that's where one of those objectives that guided the 2017's change, that information asymmetry, I think that was a reaction directly to this model, where committee reports come up, they're there, you have an opportunity to ask questions, certainly you can pull in staff, but you're not going to have a full presentation of these items in the way that the committee did. And if the committee is having conversations leading to action, as we try to do, you're not going to have access to that information unless you're reading the docket. And that's important, right? You could go in and read the docket, but there was no video recording, right? You couldn't go back and watch the meetings. All you could do was either trust the regents on that committee, read the docket, ask a few questions, but there wasn't sort of the rehashing of that when it came up on the committee report, with the exception of something like the operating budget, which we did then put on as a standalone item. We also used a couple of those work sessions at times to try to address that as well. But that was really one of the main causes for that information asymmetry feeling and sense.
Thank you for that clarification. It's helpful to keep in mind that the recordings and access is certainly a newer function of this board. Any follow-up, Regent Mayron? You are on mute.
The reason I'm asking that is now I'm drawing on my experience on other boards that I've been on, where so much of the work that ultimately leads to a board decision is done in the committees, which are smaller groups, and those committees may work on particular topics for quite some period of time. They may do periodic reporting to the board on where the direction they're going, and seek feedback from the board. And then ultimately, when it's presented to the board, there's at least in my experience, quite a robust presentation by the committee on what it is they're recommending. It's a very different structure than we have, particularly where we have committees meeting by and large the day before the board acts. There's just not that kind of time lag to educate the rest of the board members about what it is that the committee is doing. And so I'm at this point not suggesting we should be going to that model, but I think probably I'm not the only one who has come from models like that are used on other boards, where the committee work is done over a period of time, and then the education process that goes through bringing the rest of the board up to speed to address the asymmetry issue. And granted, those boards that I've been on are larger boards as well. So maybe you have a committee of 6 or 8 and presenting to a board of 30 or something like that. But, given everything's conceivably at this point on the table, I wanted to make sure I got an understanding about how it is committees educated the board to get to a place of hopefully acting on an item that the committee had acted on.
Great. Regent Turner?
Two things. So in regards to, in my experience, it would be a task force that would be doing extensive work on the side, which is totally different from a standing committee or that kind of thing. So that's my experience with boards. I was noting that each time we readjust it, the lunch period gets shorter and shorter. Did you all know that? We're down to 45 minutes. If we keep structuring it differently, we'll be down to a nurse's break, which is 5 minutes with a bagel standing by the IV pump. So
Better than a lawyer's break, I'll tell you that much.
So I just.
The burrito over a trash can, so.
Oh, okay, we could relate, okay, cool. And you know, the only reason is, because I always have to be careful of this, is that much as you are such devoted employees that work for the board, et cetera, I worry that you get your proper break time. And if we keep cutting it, then by law, you are entitled to a certain amount of break time. And so I'm very conscious of that kind of thing.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I have found on this board, every board I've served on has always had full agendas, whether it's a work day followed by a board day or 2 work days followed by board days. But with this one, I have found it feels extra full. And have often wondered whether we're all getting enough space in between certain subjects to kind of reset and give our brains a chance to take in everything we just heard through a presentation before we jump into the next one. And so that topic is really interesting to think about as we think about the function of the committee structures and portfolios of the committees, but also thinking about how we're transitioning between each of those as well. Regent Hipsch.
Thanks, Chair Verhalen. Well, so where I'm at on this is, I'm going to go through this. I like litigation review as it is, audit compliance as it is. I think government policy is good as it is. I think university relations is important enough that it should be its own committee. And I think academic health is important enough and big enough that it should be its own committee forever, because it's half of our people. And I think mission is great. I think the reason why we get on these boards is for mission. And if you take 6 of us off of mission, that takes away the fun of being on the board. That's right. So I like the mission. But where I think I would like to split finance and operations into 2 committees. Operations and human resources, and finance and facilities. And the reason is because most of your facilities are tied to finance in some way, or getting money from legislature, or whatever you're doing. And it seems like a good break. But operations and human resources, I mean, just about every company in the world has a chief operating officer that's separate from the chief financial officer. And they're 2 different skill sets, and they're 2 different, and I don't think we get to spend enough time on human resources for having 20,000 employees. I think that's a big enough committee. So that's where I'm at. And I think finance and operations has gotten so big that we only get to the surface of it. And I think finance and facilities should be the whole board too, because that's setting the budget, that's going through facilities, and we all need to be educated on that. But operations and human resources could be a 6-person committee. So that's kind of where I'm at on this whole thing. I could change, and I agree fully with what our Regent Mayor said. I think the committees need to meet when they need to meet, and we need more field trips to be good committee members. And so we need to go out and see, and I don't think we can govern this from this, table. So, and I think that's part of what a committee does, is it goes out and it sees, and it's the eyes and ears for the whole board, and they're making good recommendations. And so, not all the time, but sometimes, so that's kind of where I'm at.
You raised a point that struck me from the pre-2017 structure, which was there used to be a committee on academic and student affairs, and then there was a separate committee on faculty and staff affairs. Mm-hmm. And really highlighting the 2 very important stakeholder groups of the University of Minnesota through those 2 committees, but through different lenses, because they have interrelated but differing needs.
To your point, I'd like to hear what other people have to say about that, because the students are really tied to the faculty and the faculty are really tied to the students. And if you separate them, you could have two different diverging goals. So I'd like to hear what faculty and students have to say if they'd rather be in one committee or two there. So I agree with you, though, it's awful big committee, so
Yeah,
it's all part of mission too.
it is. Regent Wheeler.
Yeah, well, I'm going to echo some of what Regent Hips just said. First of all, let me just say, from our retreat and looking at the priorities for this university, the priorities the board set, and then the committee structure that we talked about, including the evolution of the special committees, I just want to thank board leadership and the Office of the Board of Regents for setting it up, I think, in a very thoughtful way based on that conversation. I agree that the structure works well, except for I get concerned about finance and operations and on the human resource side as well. So mission fulfillment does the promotion, and I'm learning, so just know that. It's still relatively new. Mission fulfillment does a good job with promotion and tenure. But in finance and operations is asked to take on compensation issues, yes. But there doesn't seem, at least in the crafting of the work plan that I've seen, room for succession planning, room for engagement, room for wellness benefits, room for those things that you tend to, in a human resource. So I'm just adamantly agreeing with you, Regent Hips, about the need to focus on the people, which are so critical to everything that we do in terms and service of our mission.
Regent Turner.
Thank you, Chair Van Halen. I just want to clarify, you're still saying, Regent Hips, that the finance would still be the full board? Because that is part of our fiduciary responsibility of a board. That's your main reason, is your fiduciaries, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just operations that would be a separate committee that if you chose to be on it, and that would involve HR, et cetera.
HR and operations, the day-to-day operations, but yes.
So would it would we end up with an oddball number of committees?
That's what we have. That's what we have a board for.
Well, and having an odd number of committees just requires us to potentially think differently about how we arrange those committees. To the point of, do we have a couple committees that meet alternating instead of meeting every meeting? Do we have a couple committees that instead meet on Wednesdays or being flexible in some of that to have those discussions? So we're not wedded to a block schedule necessarily, but making sure that we're thinking about different ways to play Tetris.
Can I do a follow-up?
You may, yes,
to
of
your
course.
comment? Because I agree with you that it needs to be potentially stretched out just a little bit more. That it, like yesterday, that some of these meetings so far are an exercise in endurance. And
In what?
an exercise in endurance. And where you are getting one massive conversation and report after another. And so then it just feels like we're just here to get all this information thrown at us, quick vote, and this subject, and it just feels, you express it way better than I do, but it just feels like we're not having the potential to be as quite of a working board around this table. And I agree with you totally that working to me also means going out. But as far as how this day goes, that's just my first impressions after only being here for 3-4 months, so.
Yeah, well, and every time we have a presenter or presenters in front of us, it's not just their time that has gone into putting that together, it's everyone behind them that has spent countless hours getting that material ready. And for me, when I show up here, I want to make sure that I'm taking in every little piece of information they can. I mean, going through the materials, I think yesterday about the UMD action plan, campus and climate action plan, there was so much information in that docket, and I had I had to chunk it out and read it over several different sessions because it was a lot of information, but it was all so important to understand the nuances of what that campus is considering, what its future looks like, what direction they're heading. And then the presentation yesterday, again, full of super helpful information. But thinking through the process and reminding ourselves, yes, we're taking all of this in and we're going to revisit this again next month or next meeting to talk through, what our action is going to be on the plan. And trying to remind myself of that every time we go into these of, okay, is this review in action? And to our point earlier. So I think I want to give our presenters the audience they need as well. So thinking about how are there certain things we should be dividing up or keeping together for purposes of making sure we're keeping purposeful cohesion between them versus dividing them up so that we can give each of them a little more space to expand or dive into something a bit deeper is, I feel, especially looking through all these materials and talking with staff before this, is kind of the tension that this board has had at least over the last 8 years.
All boards.
Regent Johnson.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to follow up to Regent Hipsch, especially. I think Regents Hipsch and Verhalen and I are in our third year on the board, and it's very clear that, meeting after meeting, year after year, the Finance and Ops Committee is just incredible. That report, the amount that has to be done, it's just huge. It's huge.
Yeah.
And it always feels that way. Most of us, I think, in mission fulfillment, other things, are able to present things in that time allotment and have good discussions. But that's just, it's such a volume of material, and we don't need to, not all of it probably has to be there in that same sense. So if we can sort that out as you suggest, or the best formulation of that, I would strongly, approve and encourage that, because I think that will allow us to really help make decisions on the big things that we need to, and then the HR and Ops will get the attention it needs, but we'll do it in a format that separates it out from that. And then one other thing I'd just like to mention too is I was wondering, as we looked, some of the special committee things, certainly, the academic health is a huge thing. It's very important with what's going on now, but it will continue to be, and there are many more things going on as we look toward a new campus, a new building. There's a lot that's going to be going on. And as we may recall from our, running for this position 3 years ago, the academic health is 40%, those 6 schools are 40% of the entire budget. And so I think it's important we have some of that, and that might help us focus that. So if there then needs to be an interface with finance and ops about that, we have a good, context for that on the board.
And while the focus of the questions and what this topic is, the committee structure,
Right.
interwoven in that is each of the committee portfolios.
Right.
Assistant Secretary Langworthy.
Yeah, Chair Verhalen, Regent Johnson, I was just going to mention, right, part of the fullness of finance and operations are the number of things that are reserved to the board and the approval thresholds. And so that conversation, which will be running in parallel to this conversation, I think will be important for you to think, what do you want to keep reserved to you? What do you want to delegate? Or how do you want those approval thresholds to change? Because right now, finance and operations has the vast majority of areas that are reserved to you, because that's historically how that's developed. So I would say keep that conversation in mind as you're also thinking about the committee structure.
Yeah, Regent Mayron.
Thank you. There's 2 things that I want to that I've been reminding myself is, at the end of the day, hopefully the committee structure and portfolio is reflecting what it is that we think will best serve the university and best serve us in our role in guiding the university. So it ought to be what I want to make sure is that we have a committee structure that supports what it is we're trying to do today and what we anticipate what we're going to be doing in the future, and be open to the idea that what worked in the past may not be as relevant as it was then for us now. And so not feel like we have to be continue whatever the structure is because it was done that way in the past. The question is this going to best serve us on the future? So that for me, that's a guiding principle as I try to step back and look at this. And it seems to me once we can get to a place of again, it's all intertwined, what that portfolio is of each of the committees, then that will allow us to look at, and we think those, we need those committees and they would best serve the advancement of our work in the university. Then we can begin to talk about the best way to structure those committees, whether it's size or composition or how frequently it meets. I mean, one of the things I'm hearing, I mean, I think all of us are exhausted when we have our board meetings back to back with the Thursday set of meetings. If we're exhausted, you are exhausted in the boardroom, let me tell you what it's like to sit in a chair, well, you all know, in Zoom forever. It's awful, as you may recall. But, you know, there was a decision made to have us only meet at 8 times a year, I think is what we're under our current schedule. And I'm sure there was a reason for that, but it seems to me, and maybe Jason or Brian can educate us, but we do have the option of having work being done 12 times a year. I mean, and even, I'm not suggesting more frequently, but we do have months where we're not meeting other than if we have a special meeting. And we may have an opportunity to be able to spread out some of what we're doing and to feel like we have more time to consider certain issues if we were to look at, and this would be into the future. I can't imagine enacting any of this in this fiscal year. A different timing structure for how frequently we're going to meet and for how long. So I throw out the idea we do have 12 months of a year as opposed to what we're trying to accomplish in 8 sessions a year.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, we also should think about if we're tired sitting here listening to all of this, how tired are those who've put in all the time in the presentations and the docket materials up to this point, who are then watching us try and absorb all the information that they've given us. The other thing I'll say is, and it's certainly not lost on me, is every time we have a meeting, we have a whole lot of people sitting in the room here, very intently and purposefully paying attention and taking in all of the discussions we're having as well, so that they can do their jobs better. And so every time we meet, they are taking time to multitask and cover their own responsibilities while also being here to hear the conversations we're having. And so I think that balance is also important as we think about what our structure looks like. We also need to make sure that our structure is not getting in the way of other things. Regent Hipsch, I will call on you, and just for time, we'll be wrapping up here shortly so we can stay on schedule.
Just have a quick comment on a thing you said earlier, and it's about the Duluth Master Plan. That's a good example of some place where, when we're talking about the Duluth Master Plan, we should be in Duluth. We should be in the community. We should be looking at the campus and seeing it from the ground level, and not from our screens here. And we don't do these master plans that often, and I think that as we're planning the future master plans, that's when we should visit the campuses. Because I think it's really, it's really important to see that from the ground level and to visit with community leaders and get them involved in our master plan as well, and just show our faces. So I'd just leave it there.
I think I heard a silent cheer from the chancellor at Duluth when.
Oh, did he?
Not in the room.
No, he's not.
He left the room when I made that nice comment.
I'm sure he heard it out in the hall.
Just kidding.
Regent Chair Verhalen, I just want to make one other, I know we were going to end with Doug, but let me just make one other quick comment. And that is, again, as we talk about the structure, it seems to me there are 2 different things going on in our committees. One is to educate us, and the other is to engage in discussion for review and ultimately action. And so it seems to me that as we talk about how we conduct our business, it may be that there are ways to separate out of committees the education component, which presumably should all of us could benefit from those the work of the committees that involve action items. And that may allow us to reconstitute some of the work of the committees. For example, finance and ops, which we've all said is huge, but that one carries, you know, we have both educational components and we have action items. It may be possible to separate some of that out. Similarly, with right now with mission fulfillment, much of that work is education as opposed to action items. Mm-hmm. So again, just putting everything on the table.
Yeah. I guess just a comment. I think as we think about the structure, if we are adding, you know, consider adding more meetings like every month or whatever, and more travel. I mean, that is a lot of time and work from individual regents, and we just have to think. I mean, I don't think it should be you have to be retired or not working or whatever to be able to do all these things. And so that if we expand the amount of time in these formal things, I think we just have to think about that.
Yeah.
And whether that will be a deterrent to people considering to serve on the board. I think this is very important. I think every one of us who are here loves what we wouldn't be here if we didn't care about the university, if we didn't want to be doing these things, but some way to, with the workload, and maybe some things, you know, can be done remotely, but I mean, if we're going to travel a lot and, you know, meet more, I just think we just have to consider that.
Yeah, and our staff and faculty and our bargaining leaders who show up here are taking time from their campuses and their locations to be here as well.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, this was a very good discussion. I saw Executive Director Steves taking many notes, and hopefully you will help independently drive up the number of views of this video on the recording afterward, watching it over and over again. But
Yeah, that works.
there was a lot of really good discussion here, and so thank you all very much. Very appreciated. But finally, we're going to turn to the information items. So Executive Director Steves, anything you would like to highlight here?
I'll just note, Chair Verhalen, that there are 2 policies that are noted in the docket that have completed comprehensive review, and there are no recommended amendments. One is on the founding date, corporate name and seal, and university marks, and the other is on the mission statement. Neither of those policies are coming forward for any action at this point.
Very good. There being no additional, or actually, any questions on that? Sorry. Okay. There being no additional business before the committee, we stand adjourned until
28-ish.
Ish.